Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Today, I am joined by our clinical nutritionist, Mel, and we are going to be talking about food intolerances. Welcome, Mel.
Hi, Jess. How are you?
I'm good. It's so good to have you back on the podcast because, this is an area I think that there's a lot of confusion and it can be really difficult for parents to navigate this on their own. So before we get started into the topic of food intolerances, can you just tell our listeners who may not know you a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I am a clinical nutritionist here at Natural Super Kids, and I see clients on Wednesdays and Fridays. And a lot of my clients come to me with symptoms that are related to a food intolerance. So I'm really excited to kind of dive deeper and hopefully support our podcast listeners in this area.
Yes, and I want to mention also we have done a very early episode on addressing food intolerances and sensitivities in kids. So that is episode 9. If anyone wants to dive a bit deeper into this topic, we're going to be reiterating some of that content that we did cover back in episode 9. But Mel's going to dive into also some success stories that she's had when it comes to clients with food intolerances and how she manages food intolerances with her clients. But before we get into that, let's start with the basics of food intolerances. Can you tell us a bit more, Mel?
Yeah, sure. So before we get started, I just wanted to, go over the difference between a food allergy and a food intolerance and how it manifests in the body.
Yes.
Because that way it kind of just gives you a few more answers of whether you need to see an allergist or whether you should be working with a nutritionist on how to manage this. So a food allergy manifests in the body via an immune response to the food. So when a food is consumed, the immune system thinks basically that food's trying to kill it and that you're under attack, and triggers an allergic reaction. So allergic reactions can look like digestive symptoms such as vomiting, flushing of the skin, rashes, hives, and then we've got like our breathing difficulties and, of course, swelling of the tongue and lips and anaphylactic shock. So I guess the top 8 allergens are eggs, milk products, wheat, soy, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, and shellfish. So if you suspect that your child has a food allergy, it's best to work with an allergist for management of that, because that is an immune response. When it comes to a food intolerance, that manifests as digestive symptoms, a digestive response, and does not involve the immune system. So the reactions are less serious than an allergy and usually occur amongst the food groups such as dairy, eggs, often egg whites. And then we've got our food additives such as MSG and glutamates, histamines and other amine-containing foods, and, of course, our high FODMAP foods. So the biggest thing, one way to determine an allergy versus an intolerance is actually the timing of the reaction. So an allergic reaction will occur very soon after the child has encountered the allergen, where a food intolerance can take as long as 12 to 24 hours for symptoms to appear, which is what happens quite frequently in my clients. They'll say, it's a lot of things happen overnight, like a lot of sleep disturbances, and we kind of have to backtrack a lot when it comes to food intolerances. Like, okay, what did your child eat for dinner? Or what did your child eat for breakfast? Or, 2 days ago. So we'll get to how we kind of manage that. But and then also, and when it comes to allergy versus intolerance, a symptom of an allergic reaction can occur with just a trace amount of the allergen, whereas with a food intolerance, children can often tolerate much more of the food, and it can occur with a buildup of the food over multiple days. So rather than having, an allergic reaction to a peanut where you've kind of just got a tiny little sniff of the peanut and you have a reaction, when it comes to an allergy, your child could have, ice cream 3 days in a row and then have a reaction. Sorry, I think I mixed that up. When it comes to an intolerance, they can have a buildup of the food and then they have the reaction.
Yes, exactly. And that's so important. What you've just sort of explained there really highlights why it's so much harder to pick up and determine, what foods may be causing an intolerant sort of reaction as opposed to an allergy reaction, because it's usually pretty obvious when our kids are having an allergic reaction, but not so obvious when our kids, have food intolerances.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone has a threshold as well of like how much they can consume of the food intolerance triggers, I guess. So it could just come down to that the threshold just needs work. So you're kind of, I like to talk about buckets. So, when it comes to dairy, your child's bucket might only be able to tolerate a small amount of dairy every day rather than, dairy for breakfast, lunch and dinner.
Yes.
And that's where the reactions occur. It's when they're having it continually through the day. But when we kind of minimize it to just breakfast, dairy at breakfast, then there is no symptoms present.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a good example as well, which again makes it trickier to figure it out because, a lot of parents will say, well, my daughter was fine with dairy yesterday, but she's not so fine with it today, which can make it just more confusing. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Tell us a little bit more about the common food intolerances that you're seeing in clinic.
Yeah. So I guess the two common are dairy and gluten, followed by soy. And then we kind of get into the high FODMAP foods. And then I would say histamine. Histamine's a bit of a tricky one. It's sometimes, the last resort to kind of get to it. But that one's more so, hay fever, hives, eczema kind of clients. We look into a histamine picture with those clients.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing with these kind of more, food chemical kind of sensitivities, the salicylates and the histamines and the amines, like it can be really tricky to figure those ones out because they are in, these sort of substances are in a whole heap, like a really broad range of foods, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really a puzzle. So you've got to really kind of track a lot of data, which we'll get to, and put the pieces together. And that's why it's really important to work with a practitioner because that's what we're trained to do. We're trained to put the pieces of the puzzle together and work out the connections of, okay, this food was consumed and that falls under this food group. So, it's very confusing. I empathize with parents going through this, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, that's for sure.
Definitely. And just having that outside perspective as well. Like when you're in it as a parent and you're trying to figure it out and you're like, it can be really tricky, but having that external perspective from a practitioner who knows, who's educated on this is so important. So before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of managing and uncovering food intolerances, I know you mentioned that, food intolerances are a digestive response, but the signs and symptoms of food intolerances, yes, there can be those digestive symptoms, but they can be broader as well. So can you talk us through some of the more common signs and symptoms of food intolerances?
Yeah, sure. So first up, we have obviously the digestive tract. So you'll see things like constipation, diarrhea, pain, flatulence, and bloating. And then we see a lot of mood disturbances. So poor sleep, restlessness overnight, cranky, irritable. But when we look back to it, we think, well, why is that child sleeping poorly and why are they restless? It's likely that they're in pain in their digestive tract. Same thing with, I see a lot of poor appetite. And that's kind of linked back to, well, why would you want to eat when you're in pain? So a lot of kids will just, they'll nibble all day. They won't want big meals. They're very fussy eaters. But in their little brains, they're correlating, well, this food makes my tummy sore. So that's why there is poor appetite there. And then we see things like eczema, dermatitis, keratosis pilaris, so a lot of skin conditions. And again, that can be linked to digestion because it's about that gut dysbiosis, the inflammation that's occurring from the foods. They would be my kind of top 4 really: digestion, mood disturbances, poor appetite, and then skin.
Yes. And I really resonate with that appetite, like all of them, but the appetite one, I can think of a couple of clients, where we've really managed to get on top of food intolerances and a child's appetite improves, because poor appetite in kids can look like, they're fussy or they're picky. So those kinds of eating, different eating preferences can be involved as well. All right. So let's talk about, where you start with all of this as a nutritionist when you are supporting clients with food intolerances.
Yeah, sure. So obviously in an initial consultation, I ask a series of questions and really thorough case taking. So as I'm asking those questions, already in my head, I'm kind of like, oh, is it a food intolerance or is this, this food a red flag? And then I guess in terms of working with the parents, the number one thing I suggest is starting a food diary. A lot of my clients, their parents kind of come to me and they're like, I think it could be avocado or I think it's pears. And then I'll ask them a question like, okay, so, how many times a week are they eating pears? And, how long does it take for the pear to cause a reaction? And they're kind of like, oh, I don't know. And the thing is like when you're a parent dealing with a child who has an upset tummy, isn't sleeping very well, your nervous system's also being affected. So with a food diary, it allows you to get the data out of your head and onto paper, where you can then go back and say, okay, so 2 days ago, Johnny ate ice cream cake and then, he's now got a rash, he's got constipation and he has really poor sleep. So then we've got more data to work with and more, I guess, pieces of the puzzle to slot together. So once I get my clients to do a diet diary, I do it for 7 to 14 days. They send it back to me. I analyze it. So I go through and I go, okay, they had a bad sleep on this day. What did they eat, 2 days before? And it's a lot of like highlighting and circles and things like that. A lot of lines and a bit of a mind map. So then when we determine the, I guess, trigger foods, we then do a temporary restriction. So we'll do elimination of those foods. And the big thing is to note when you do eliminate those foods, do you notice that the symptoms improve? So that's something that I always get. I just check in with my clients, their parents, and just say, hi, it's been, 4 or 5 days since Johnny ate dairy, just checking in to see if you've noticed any reduction of symptoms. And then we work on reintroduction. So the duration of elimination is usually around 4 to 6 weeks. And whilst we're doing that, we are working on the gut microbiome, inflammation, and also, I guess, increasing the foods. If we're taking away dairy, then we're looking at increasing other calcium-rich foods and things like that. So making sure that the child is still getting all the micronutrients across their diet. So a lot of the time with intolerances, it's actually not the food, it's the amount that is consumed. So when we look at reintroducing, we are also looking at where the threshold lies. So can the child eat, dairy once a day and they're fine, they don't have any symptoms? Or can they eat it twice a day? So we're really trying to figure out where that threshold is. Because if you do not have an allergy, then you shouldn't be cutting food groups. It's all about figuring out where your threshold lies and continuing to consume that food. So that's really important, figuring out the threshold. And then, as I said, as we take away the food, we work on supplements to help the process, help heal the gut, reduce inflammation, improve the microbiome. So we'll look at things like probiotics. One thing to note with probiotics, it depends on the strain that we use, depends on what symptoms are occurring. Is it eczema? Is it constipation? Is it, flatulence, things like that? Because probiotics aren't a one-size-fits-all. They all have a very specific role to play. So we choose a specific probiotic strain to suit the symptoms. And then also prebiotics, that again depends on the symptoms because we don't want to exacerbate symptoms. We don't want to give them too much fiber and then have that ferment and cause bloating. So that again it's really important to work with a practitioner to know what will work best for your child's symptoms. But we love using PHGG and pectin. They're kind of two ones that we kind of like to use. And then we'll look at inflammation and enzyme production. So supplements that contain zinc, slippery elm, turmeric, things like that. And yeah, another note I just wanted to mention about supplements and why it's important to work with a practitioner is because a lot of supplements on the shelf at the chemist contain excipients. And so excipients can be things like soy, corn, dairy, things like that. So you might think that you're doing a great job by giving your child a supplement or a probiotic from Chemist Warehouse, but actually it contains the food that you're trying to avoid. So it's not going to work. You're kind of giving them the trigger food. So yeah, that's a really important thing because with intolerance and allergy kids, we're very particular about what supplements we use. We check for excipients, we check for extra ingredients to ensure that they will not be consuming a product that has their trigger foods in it.
Yes, such a good point. Oh, you've just mentioned so many good things. I just wanted to just elaborate on a couple of those points. So, Mel was talking about, a parent saying, oh, maybe, it might be avocado or maybe it's pear. And so, it can be confusing thinking, does this one fruit, cause these issues in my child? Whereas that's a red flag. For example, we know as practitioners that pear is high in fructose. So then maybe, it's not necessarily just the pear, it's high fructose foods, or avocado, is a high FODMAP food. So if a parent's telling us that is a trigger, then we're thinking of FODMAPs as a whole. So that's another, benefit of working with a practitioner, as well as you mentioned, filling in those nutritional gaps. If we're eliminating foods for a period of time, we want to make sure all the nutritional needs of a child, particularly even more important than an adult, are being met. And the third point of building up that digestive function, because often we can really start to improve that tolerance level for a particular food by working on digestive function, improving, enzyme production, and like, as you were saying, Mel, reducing inflammation, and that sort of thing. So, just wanted to add those points. And I think from you talking, Mel, even for me, I'm like, oh, it really is a minefield. And so this is an area where working with a practitioner, is so important and can really fast track the progress that you make when it comes to your child's health.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for explaining all of that to us. Now, let's talk about some of the success stories that you have had with clients, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, so a lot of my clients will come to me for things like constipation or eczema, or poor sleep is really high up there. It's like very restless sleeping, waking up a lot. So I wanted to chat about my she's about to nearly turn 2. She'll be 2 in September, Alice. So she came to me when she was 18 months old, really poor sleep, like awake just all the time overnight, abdominal pain. Her tummy was rock hard. She's a contact napper, so she was constantly attached to mum, waking every night screaming, absolutely no appetite, like ate like a tiny little bird. She just wouldn't eat anything. And then her stool was pale with mucus. So mum had already kind of determined that she thought that gluten, dairy, and soy were triggers. So at the moment, we are just about to reintroduce, but I wanted to kind of pinpoint the improvements that have been made since eliminating gluten, dairy, and soy. So she is now pooing once a day. They're brown, so they're no longer pale, and no mucus. So then we can determine that there's no inflammation there. The stomach is no longer bloated and stiff, but the biggest thing is her appetite. She is eating 3 meals a day. She's having snacks. She's not fussy at all. She's just completely eating a wide variety of foods. So we did food diary, food elimination, both mum and Alice, because mum is breastfeeding. So that's also something else to note. If you're breastfeeding, you need to do the elimination as well. And then we did very, very specific probiotic strains and worked on healing that gut. So at the moment, we're about to reintroduce dairy. The reason we haven't reintroduced it yet is because Alice has been unwell with a cold and just the winter bugs, and it's always best to reintroduce when your child is 100% healthy. So that's what we're moving on to in this next phase. I also had a 2-year-old come to me again at 18 months. I don't know if this is a trend. I do see a lot of toddlers, but he was chronically constipated. So he did 1 stool, which were tiny little pellets, every 10 days. He was in so much pain. So it was affecting his parents as well, just watching him in pain. Because he knew the stool and passing the stool was going to hurt, he would hold on a lot. And this was affecting his sleep. So he was awake probably every hour. And then he treated his mum to a lovely awake window from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. every day. Oh, every morning. And because of that, he was miserable. Like, he just needed to be held. He was so tired. He cried a lot. So same thing, we did food diary, elimination, gut healing. I also threw in some nervous system support there for Ted. And then now he is passing when we eliminated dairy and gluten, he was passing a sausage stool every day. So 1 to 2 stools a day, no pain, no mucus. His mood, he's so much happier. He has an improved appetite. His sleep still isn't great. He is waking once or twice a night, but only for like 10 minutes. So that 1 to 4 a.m. sleep wake window, has reduced. I mean, it's gone completely. Yeah, so it's just still the waking, but he is also breastfed. So I think that he's waking for the boob and for comfort. So mum's ready to wean. So we're kind of working on that night weaning now. And I'm offering kind of a big part of this is obviously offering emotional support as well. So I'm helping mum through that as well. And one thing I did want to note is when we introduced gluten and dairy back into Ted's diet, well, actually, we hadn't introduced it yet, but mum was consuming gluten and she didn't actually tell me. So she was consuming gluten halfway kind of through this, and Ted became constipated again. So I was like, oh gosh, like what's going on? And then his mum confessed, I guess, that she had been eating a bit of gluten. And she just didn't think that the small amount she was eating would affect him through her breast milk. So for me, we are now looking at, okay, well, what's Ted's threshold of eating gluten? Is it an actual gluten allergy? He has celiac disease in his family? So that's a red flag. So we're working together to figure out, was it just, a hiccup in the system? Did he become constipated because of the gluten, or was it something else? So that's another thing too, working with a practitioner is it's a lot of trial and error. So we're kind of like, you have success, and then, you get to a point where you're like, oh no, they're constipated again. So you do feel like you're backtracking, but it's really about figuring out the sweet spot and the threshold of like what they can consume. So it's not a failure. It just means that we haven't got to the sweet spot yet.
Yeah, and you learn from that, don't you? I mean, sometimes when you do reintroduce things back in and you realize where that tolerance level is, and then life gets busy and, things kind of get out of hand and you go over that tolerance level. So then things go backwards. So it is definitely a process, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's hard on parents, their lack of sleep, watching your child who's constipated, who can't pass a stool and is distressed. You're overwhelmed with like what you need to do. So a big part of my job is emotional support for the parents and like being that voice of reason and just kind of sitting here and allowing the parents to vent, because it can be hard. You're kind of like, well, why can't my child go to the toilet, or why can't they eat this food? And so by talking to a practitioner to explain the scientific reasons of why they can't, and reassuring them that if it's a food intolerance, we can eat this food. It's just that we need to figure out how much the child can eat, and we also need to figure out why their gut is reacting in a certain way with this food. So, intolerances, eliminating foods that cause reactions, we never want to cut food groups out. So it's about working on the gut, reducing the inflammation, finding your threshold, and then ensuring that this child can consume the food long term. Because if it's not an allergy, then they're safe to eat that food, but it is about figuring out where that threshold and that sweet spot is for them to consume it.
Yes. And knowing it's short term, like if you are needing to eliminate it altogether for a period of time, knowing that's not forever, because it is. It's like life is busy. It's hard enough feeding kids without any food intolerances and allergies. When you add these things in, it does make life trickier. But that's another reason that practitioner support can be so helpful, because not only are you there to support the parents through this, you can also offer really practical support in terms of not just, don't eat this and don't eat that and don't eat that and cut that out, but what can we add in to make, life easier? And there's so many alternatives these days, isn't there?
Yeah. It's just about just the support really, and, ensuring that everyone is doing this safely. We're not cutting out food groups long term, because I see a lot of people who have been low FODMAP for well over 6 weeks, and low FODMAP's meant to be, 6 weeks max, and then the slow reintroduction through, FOD, all the acronym. But if you're cutting out, low FODMAP for forever, you're losing essential prebiotics and probiotics and fiber and all those kind of micronutrients. So, if you're kind of sitting at home listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, I think my child might have an intolerance, but I wouldn't know how to get to the bottom of it. Really important to, as I said, work with a practitioner who can pull apart that diet diary and that diet data, and come up with a achievable plan for you that sees your child hopefully consuming that food again within, 3 to 6 months.
Yes. And I do just want to mention food intolerance testing quickly here, because a lot of people ask us, like, what test do you recommend to figure out what my child's intolerant to? And the answer to that is we don't generally recommend food intolerance testing. It's not very accurate. It's largely dependent on what your child has been eating or has not been eating. From past experience, using these tests with clients many years ago, I would I would order a test, and one, it would come back with a list of foods that a particular person was intolerant to, and then we'd do it again in 3 months or 6 months, and the list would be completely different.
Yeah.
So this is why we are all about the food diary, and pull, as you said so beautifully, Mel, pulling that apart, to figure out what is going on. We find the most effective way of dealing with food intolerances.
Yeah. There's no scientific research to say that these allergy testing, whether it's poo intolerance. Allergy is different. You're getting it confused. Yes. Allergy prick testing is backed by science. You see an allergist for that. Intolerance testing, which can sometimes be blood, hair, stool, there is no real scientific evidence to say that it's 100% accurate. All the data and evidence says that we're going old school. We're doing diet diaries. That's really where the research lies.
Yeah. And, it's much easier to go and get a test and get this list of foods that your child needs to avoid. But that is really not our approach, for the reason, like Mel was saying, there's no solid evidence. And also, it's just inaccurate from my experience. So doing the harder work in terms of, the diet diary and the elimination and reintroduction really is worth it in the long term, because as we've said a few times, this really isn't a forever thing. It's all about optimizing that digestive function so that your child can tolerate more foods into the future.
Yeah.
So was there anything else you wanted to add before we finish up?
No, I just think, I see a lot of intolerance clients in clinics. So I know that it can be really overwhelming, but that's my job. My job is to take the overwhelm away from you, to give you, just to simplify it. So, if you have any questions, I'm always here for bookings and consultations. I really do love working with food intolerance clients, because obviously the end result is that they're able to eat the food and live their life without any side effects. So that's what I want to see as a nutritionist.
Yes, and I will say Mel is brilliant at, you could have been a detective in another life, because that's really what this work is about. It's about, really analysing and digging in to the data and being a detective, like putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And as you were talking, about those different children that you've worked with and helped, I think that really illustrated how much of an impact food intolerances can have on not just the child's well-being and their sleep and their appetite and their nutritional, intake and their skin and all of that stuff, but also the well-being of the whole family. Having a grumpy, clingy child that doesn't sleep and is uncomfortable is no fun for anyone. So we're really just thrilled to be able to offer parents this support. So if you are wanting some support to uncover food intolerances or any of the things that we've talked about today, you can head to the show notes. We'll pop in the link to check out our appointments with Mel. And you can always head on over to naturalsuperkids.com, our website, to the book an appointment page to find out all of the details there. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us on the podcast today, Mel.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.